Today's video is going to be a little bit different, and there's several reasons for that. I guess the main one being that unfortunately, eBay has been a little bit slow for me recently, and I've even tried to source some devices privately for the Profit or Loss series, and it's not really gone too well. Either the prices are just way too high of a specific item, or there's just nothing on eBay for that specific item at all. PS5s, for example, I see a lot of errors at the moment where games are just crashing, and it makes the console restart, and a lot of the time, kind of unfixable, so no point. Plus, they're selling for £200, and I can't sell a PlayStation for $220, so there's literally no point for Profit or Loss. So I thought in this video specifically, it would be quite fun for me to look back on how I used to repair things, how I used to solder, and give potential tips and advice to people who are looking to get into repair themselves. And hopefully I'll be able to save you some time by showing my mistakes and what I would do different now. If you do enjoy this style of content, more of a teaching aspect, please let me know in the comments section down below. So let's react to some old Joey. Everyone starts somewhere, and some of the soldering you're about to see from this is horrendous. What's important is learning about your own technique and your own style, and I feel like I've adapted my own style. The first place to go to, which is probably going to be the best place to compare my soldering techniques from previous. This is my first ever live stream on the Joey Does Tech YouTube channel. Tip number one, don't use this type of flux. It says no clean. It says soldering SMD. I think I purchased this flux off of Amazon because I had no idea what flux was. And you'll see in a second how runny this flux is. They recommend for what? Like 300? Here I'm actually talking about the temperature of the iron, I'm sure, because I had bought a really cheap soldering iron from Amazon, and I think it only went up to about 350. So just to give you some sort of perspective, the iron that I use now, the Hakko FX951, I actually crank that all the way up to 450 and use that on most things. The only time that I'll put that down is if I'm working either close to plastic or if I'm soldering onto something like some pins that are very, very, very close to plastic, for example, on HDMI ports. I'll put it down to say 350 at that point. Okay, so I'm placing the component there with my tweezer, which is the right thing to do. However, there is an important step that I should have done that I feel like is very important for beginners when you start soldering. And I'll say it in a second. It's a miracle that the solder stuck to the pad is the first thing I'll say. But can you see that when I'm trying to solder, it's moving the component? Can you see that? It's just very, very awkward. I don't think I also put any flux here. You can see the panic. So I'm grabbing my tweezers. I come back in with a soldering iron. That's not horrendous. The blob itself looks, you know, it doesn't look great.
Guys, we didn't.
I'm saying that I didn't use the flux. Yeah, this tip as well is not great for soldering. It's very, very small. It's a very thin tip. You don't want that. And then I come in the other side and solder that on. Me looking back at this, I mean, it's connected to the pads, right? So functionality-wise, it's okay. The blobs themselves are not pretty, so I also have to take that into consideration. I give it a 6.5, 7 is what I'd give it. I'd probably give it a 6.5. Let's get a close-up. It's 6.5. It's not pretty, but it's functional. The first thing that I would advise is when you're putting a component onto a motherboard, which is, I actually think, kind of rare unless you're manufacturing PCBs and you've got your own board designs and you've got products for whatever reason. 9 times out of 10, you're replacing a component and you'll already have solder on the board. But I'm going to show you now exactly how I would do this now. Let me just really, really quickly remove this capacitor and we'll go to put it back on. It's a very, very fluxy board, so again, I apologize. This is also a bigger cap than the one that I was previously working on. So I've removed that cap. I'm going to put that cap to the side. I would also say as well that for 90% of my soldering right now, I actually use hot air rather than a soldering iron, but this is how I would do it if I had a soldering iron. So again, I'm just clearing up the pads to make it as comparable as possible. Here I have 2 non-soldered pads. I'm going to put a tiny bit of flux. The board is hot, so the flux is melting quite a lot. I'm going to put a tiny bit of flux there. I'll come in with my soldering iron and my leaded solder. And what I'm going to do here is I'm going to place my soldering iron on the board, on top of the pad, and come in with the solder and just tin the pad like that. Okay, so now I have one pad that's been tinned and the other one isn't. If this one was ground, I can't remember, I don't think this one's ground, I think this one's ground. With this one being ground, it's actually going to be more difficult to transfer heat onto that pad because it's connected to the ground plane. The ground plane is going to be bigger. I've tacked one of them. Okay, I'll come back in with a little bit of flux and I'm just going to, again, flux is your friend, especially in the early days. Don't be scared to use flux. Just hold the cap down and I'm going to tap my iron on the pad and the cap as best I can and use my iron on the side to attach it. Okay, so that's now attached. More flux now, probably a little bit more. You want to always keep your tip clean as well. And with the tweezers, I'm going about halfway on the cap here. I'm going to push down on the tweezers to hopefully secure, there we go, this cap in place. Just like that. And then we have one side that is soldered and the other side isn't. And then what we do is simply, because I've got a little bit of leftover flux here as well, I come over the other side, I put my iron down, and I'm just going to drop some leaded solder. Just like that. Again, the iron is on the cap itself and also the pad. It's a very important step. So I'll do it on this side. A bit more flux. That's a big blob. Don't need to be that big. And then finally, I'd come through and just give it a nice little clean. Top tip, clean flux when the board is hot. It will make your life 10 times easier. And then if I go on to 3D on my microscope, there we go. I'd say that suffice. It's not dead flat. You can see that there's like maybe, I mean, if we're talking numbers, 0.001 mil of a gap between the board and the actual component, but that is 100% soldered to the board, as you can see. This method is how I would solder if I had to, with a soldering iron, and I was soldering a cap to a PCB. So you saw how long that took me. Let me show you with hot air. I'm using my tweezers to pull the cap off the board. That cap's off. The pads are already tinned. If I had to re-tin them, that's obviously I would. And I simply come back and I hover the component. I come back in with the hot air. I wait for them both to molten, which they are now. I drop. I remove my hot air. I grab a tiny bit of flux and I reflow. And that cap is now on the board. And again, if I show you in 3D mode, I have complete confidence that this will be a much better job. That looks better, right? In my opinion, I think it looks better. I think the gap is closer and the joints just look better. And if you take into consideration how quick that was for me, it's a no-brainer in my opinion. Now, the reason why I've shown the two different methods there, not everybody is going to have access to hot air, especially when you're starting out. You can use hot air if you're lucky enough to actually have or own a hot air station. But for 90% of people who are getting into this as a hobby, doing it with a solder and iron, you're going to get worse off results, but it doesn't matter as long as it's functional. Those wires are hanging on for dear life, man. They are not embedded. That's one thing I'll say as well. You can see here that the wires themselves are sat on top of the solder. What you want is you want the wire to be inside the solder. So an example for that specifically, if I had a little bit of, I say a little bit of flux, that's so much flux for my standards usually, and tin this pad, which is M92 by the way, usually. Here's a speaker wire. So if I go and solder this in, what I did on that video is I pretty much done, I don't even think I'd be able to do it. There we go. Yeah, so I've done that. And that is, that can come off. That wire is probably going to come off. So I've kind of like soldered it on top of the solder rather than embedded it into the solder. What I should be doing instead, I'll probably do it with both of these to be fair, is you need to strip them first. That'd be the first thing I'd recommend. But you want to make sure your iron is on here long enough. Back and forth, back and forth, back and forth. Pushing down. And now those wires are embedded in the solder. So that will just ensure a stronger connection. This was actually my first time removing and replacing a charging port. Good thing to mention here, I actually used a practice board. So this was my practice go at taking out a charging port, which is something, by the way. If I could give as a tip, it would be this. It's probably like one of the most #1 things, is practice on something like a donor board before you go and do the real thing, just so you get a little bit of a feel for the job. Like, it's something I definitely recommend. And practicing what I preach, that's exactly what I did here. The only thing I would say,
change the nozzle to a bigger nozzle to cover more surface heat.
Yeah, so that's good as well. So I put the nozzle to a bigger nozzle because I wanted to cover more of the area and heat more to make it easier to come off. And it did exactly that. I managed to get the charging port off and I was like, lovely jubbly, this is easy. And then I've gone underneath the scope to remove, back then, I'll get onto this point a bit later on. Back then I used to remove the solder in these ground holes and on the pads. I don't do that now. What I tried to do here is remove it. This is one of the biggest lessons when it comes to soldering, and it can be extremely, extremely frustrating. I've done well here to clear the ground hole, and the reason why, the ground hole itself, the through hole, is so close to the edge of the PCB that it's not going to require much heat to clear it. So even with the worst of irons, you should be able to clear out this ground hole with enough flux and decent enough wick. Then as I've moved to the actual charging port further in, a different ground hole, I'm really struggling. And as you can see, it didn't go well for me. Despite adding more flux to aid the situation, that did nothing. And the reason being, there's two reasons here. Let me see if I can get the frame perfect to be able to explain. This whole thing is ground and it's all connected to each other. It's not like this is a separate bit to this bit. It just has a little bar here. So this is all connected together and it's on a big ground plate. It's going to require a lot of heat to get that solder out of the board. Now this is through hole, which basically means there's solder that goes through the board to the other side of the board. But my soldering tip does not cover the circumference of the ground plane that I'm trying to wick the solder from. This is a big no-no, especially if your soldering iron isn't that good. There's an argument to be said that if I was to use my hacker on this with, the same tip, I might actually be able to get that solder out, but then you're talking £450 up front for a decent soldering iron. Not everyone has that money when they're starting out this hobby. I move on from that one and I go to sort this one, and the exact same thing happens. The strands are coming off the wick and I'm getting hot, frustrated. I've been here for a good few minutes now trying to get this out, and I'm just getting more stressed. And now I'm trying to use my tweezers to get it out as well.
So as you can see, these two are now clean. That one's clean, that one's clean.
Because they're small. I think it's just because the diameter of them is a lot smaller than these ground ones.
Try and get these a little bit clean now, I guess. My wick is screwed, so what I'm going to attempt to do, I'm going to see if this works. I don't know if it is. Add a tiny bit of flux.
That's not a bad thing to do, add flux in this situation, but flux is not the issue here.
And a tiny bit of solder.
Adding solder here as well is a pretty good shout, I'll be honest.
Temperature, to make it easier for myself, maybe.
But I'm doing the wrong things. Because that is a mess. Look at that.
This one is playing up a little bit, trying to get solder off, as is this one.
What I've learned is I've come in with a bigger tip, which is probably the right thing to do. And that looks a lot better than what it did before. I'm going to show you the difference of what my iron back then was like and what my iron is like now. Here I have a Nintendo switchboard, which is exactly what I was working back then. For some reason, I was zoomed in 1,000 times compared to what I am now. Now, I'm going to show you this technique, but this is not the technique that I currently use to get a USB-C port onto the board. Go here. Now, I've not put any additional heat into this board at all. The first thing I'm doing is applying flux. My soldering iron tip, as you can see, is just about going to cover the whole circumference of this through hole, okay, on ground, which it wasn't doing in the video that I just showed you. Then I'm going to come in with some wick. Now, this wick is also flux coated wick, so that really, really helps. This might not clear it, by the way. Here we go. Can you see it's soaking it up? And then if I just pull it away. So as we can see, like I said, it's not got rid of it. So I'll come back in. Not going to put any more flux on just yet. I'm just going to hold my soldering iron here and see if that clears out what I need it to clear out. Just going to hold it. I'm at 450 degrees Celsius. And there we go. It's clean. Compared to what I was dealing with back then, which was just mega stress. Trust me when I say I was probably working on clearing out those ground holes for at least an hour. At least an hour. And just by having, in this circumstance, the right tool will make life a lot easier. However, what I do now when I repair Nintendo Switches specifically is I'm just going to add solder back into these. This is a donor board, FYI, so I don't really care for the state of it. Say this is how it looks after I have removed the port. What I do now, and this might help people, I use something called a drop method. I just come in with a bunch of flux, and what we're going to have here is unleaded solder. I'm going to put a leaded solder on the ground holes, very much like I just did, and then simply go over the pads with some leaded as well. Then what I would do is I would clean this up whilst the board is hot, of course, because that is the best way to clean flux. And that is now prepared for when I put a port on. What I was doing in these videos back then, I think what I was doing is I was removing the solder on all of the ground holes because I thought unleaded was bad solder, just from misinformation and me being very dumb. And then what I was doing is I was tinning the pads on the board, putting the port on without any solder in the ground holes, and then using heat to get the connection between the port and the pads. Then I would fill the ground holes afterwards, which is wrong on so many levels, for me anyway, and my method. Other people might use this method and it will work perfectly fine, but for me it was not the one. So this was very, very hard for me to put a Nintendo USB-C port on a Nintendo Switch. And as you can see, I think what I've just tried to explain, here we go. I can hear the crackling because I think maybe the flux is just really bad, or I have IPA on the board. Plus, I'm being really, really brutal with the soldering iron here. You don't want to do that. You want to be a little bit softer with the soldering iron. You don't need to press down as hard, which is why, as you can see here, I've now got missing conformal coating or solder mask, whatever it is that you want to call it. Because I've been pressing my iron very hard on the board, and that's what can happen. And the reason why this is really bad, depending on how severe it is, you have to repair this before you even continue doing the original job. Yeah.
Looks okay, no bridges from what...
I mean, there was no bridges. I'm right there, but as you can see, it just looks a little bit scratched up and poorly treated.
I can see. Now for the main attraction. Okay, here we go.
So as you can see, I've just slotted the port in and I'm going with heat. Now what I'm doing here is I'm rotating the hot air gun, not enough, and I'm also not giving it enough heat. So what I should be doing in this circumstance is rotating the hot air more and applying a higher temperature. Doing it from, again, I don't use this method specifically. I'm going to try it now. Now I'm going to ruin my my nice work and I'm going to do something a little bit different. So I'm just applying flux again to the ground holes. This is the hardest ground hole to clean, so it might be a good example of me not being able to. Yeah, it's not gonna. I'll show you in a sec. There we go. One more bit still. This is a donor, so I'm wasting a perfectly good port here. However, I just want to see if I can do it. So that's all clean now. So a port will fit in here because I don't have any solder in the ground holes, right? So those pads are tinned. Can I solder the way that I used to, which I stopped and I was never successful doing this exact thing. I'd put the port in like this, and then I would just try and heat it. So I'm going to, let me turn it this way. Hold on. I'm going to take the port off. I'm going to come in with my hot air and a little bit of flux. If I was to use this method now, this is how I would do it. But you won't see me doing this method. But I'm going to rotate my hot air. I'm 450 degrees Celsius right now, which is quite high, to be honest. And then that solder is now molten. I'm going to come off the heat. I'm going to put the port on, and I'm going to rotate the heat. Keep rotating, keep rotating. And you see how I'm not burning the plastic because I'm keeping the heat moving. And I'm going to push down. So this is how old Joey would have done it. Is it even soldered? I have no idea. Let's get our tweezers. Give it a good poke. It looks good. It looks good to me. Now the issue why I don't necessarily like or wouldn't like doing this method even now. So now I have to fill out the ground holes, right? So I flip the console over. I have to apply a lot of flux here in order to get that solder flowing, which is why I don't think I would like to use this method, because then there's a lot of cleanup involved. So I'd go on the back. And can you see that now that I'm applying flux, there's a chance of it to just go inside the port? That's what I don't want. I don't want a fluxy port. Nobody wants a fluxy port. And then I would just simply come in with my soldering iron and hold the iron here to make sure that it's definitely going through to the other side. And a good way to see that is when that solder drops. So can you see the solder being sucked up and there's less on my iron? There we go. And I'll do this last one here. And you can see all that flux bubbling inside the port. Can you see it just where the black plastic is? There we go. I think that's gone through to the other side. I'm not too sure. How does this look? I mean, I can't lie. It looks successful. So all of the pins are attached to the board, which is good. And if you look, you can see that the solder's come through. What am I talking about? You can see here that the solder's come through the board. This isn't a method that I would use, okay? Just to confirm. The method that I would use, I've done 100 times on the channel, is I just drop the port in whilst the solder is here. But I mean, that's not horrendous. And there's no burnt plastic here because, again, I was moving that hot air around. So this is exactly what I've just done. And this one is a bit of a big ball of solder. And there is an issue with this. It may not look like it. It might have gone all the way through. But the way that I'm looking at this blob, that's a sign that it hasn't gone through. It's more so sat on the top layer rather than actually sunk through. Whereas if you look at this one, you can see that it's gone through the board, right? But I didn't know any better back then. This was, as you can see from the title up here, this was my first time ever doing a HDMI port replacement.
It actually wiggles. It's very, very loose from the board.
That was the situation with this board. Look at that.
All the pads are still intact, which to me is amazing. Be applying a little bit of flux to both of these joints here.
Don't necessarily need flux. Nowadays, when I remove a HDMI port, I don't put any flux on the port at all. None. Okay, so what it looks like I'm doing here, I mean, it's pretty evident to see. I'm adding leaded solder to go ahead and pull the port off. Whilst this isn't a bad, horrendous idea, because I'm going to have to do it to the pins on the other side of the board as well, it's a waste of time. The solder in this case, I guess on the ground hole specifically, is not necessarily the issue, and you can clean up the solder afterwards. You can take the solder off the board, but just applying leaded here, there will be certain situations, of course, with any soldering that you have to apply leaded or even low melt, but this definitely wasn't one of them, and I wouldn't recommend doing it. And let's see how I actually go ahead and do oh, there is a missing pad. So this might be the first trace repair, actually. Okay, so clearly what I'm doing here as well, which is good, is did I remove the solder? I don't think I did. I think I just put a leaded on, which is perfect. Yeah, I would agree that that was okay. I mean, the solder, the port has come away from the board in this situation because there is probably a lack of solder on the Xbox One S, but more so because the person who obviously owned the console was ragging the port around. But this is good that I'm putting fresh solder on top of it. I thought I cleaned it off first, but this is good. Unless I come in and clean it off now, because if I do that, that's a bit, yeah, okay, fine. That's a bit silly. I mean, it's okay. It's just, again, a time-consuming thing. If I was doing this as a business, as a service for somebody, you want to work as efficient, but still do a good job as possible, and you just don't need to remove the solder. And I'm cleaning out the ground holes, which again is just not something that's needed. And you can see that I'm struggling. There's a bit of wick I can see in here. It's just not, I don't need to do that. So I'm probably using the same method as what I used with the Nintendo Switch one, where I just dump the port in and then go from there. Okay, let's have a look at my first technically trace repair. So I'm getting rid of the enamel on the wire, which is good. I would say that this trace is way too big. It's probably around about, it's bigger than the actual trace itself, which is usually a big no-no, and it's quite thick. The reason why this could be an issue is because if you put the port on and the trace wire is too thick, this one will sit down, but it won't sit down on the rest of the pads because this wire is pushing the pins up. I'm using the tweezers to keep the wire steady. I should have pre-tinned the wire before I done this, but it's not horrendous. And then I cut it. Probably cut it a bit too long here. I could probably cut it up to where it begins, just here. I'm cleaning as I go. Lovely jubbly. I think I've done that since the beginning, so I give myself some points. I'm putting, again, some solder mask, a little bit of a waste just being there. I think I've done it for like more of an anchor point to keep it solid, but it's not needed, especially if I've got an anchor point up here at the top. Plus, there's quite a lot of trace to solder to here. So even if I didn't have that anchoring up here, I don't think it would matter too much. So I've put the port on, and then I'm just soldering the pins individually, which again is something that I learned. I can't remember who I specifically learned from doing this technique, but it's because the first time I was trying it, I was obviously just following other people. And like I said, the more you get into this game and repair, the more you kind of develop your own methodology, and you come up with your own ideas and stuff. The reason why this solder isn't flowing very nice, by the way, is because I'm not getting a very good connection with the soldering iron itself on the pads and on the pins. And the reason being is because the pins are probably propped up because of the fact of the thickness of this wire. So what's happening is all this solder is just gathering on the pins and not the board. So I'm applying flux here, and I'm trying to sort out these bridges, which is, technically the right thing to do. It's just I'm making my life a lot harder than it needs to be at this point. But the amount of time that it actually takes me to do this, and this HDMI port swap now, it takes, if I've got a motherboard out and I'm doing a HDMI port swap, no more than 5 minutes to actually do the swap itself, potentially even quicker. It's the disassembling that takes ages. And then I'm just kind of filling out the ground holes, which again, my method here isn't too bad. Do I make sure that I get, so my soldering iron is touching the metal on the port, and it's also touching the board. So that's good. And then you apply the solder, and that's how you get a nice good flow there. I don't know what happened to the one at the top. Did I not do that here? I did. Maybe I just didn't have enough heat on the iron. And then I go ahead and I test this, and I think I get a display. Yes, I do. And I was very happy. It's going to be an LCD connector replacement, and I'm very scared at how I do with this. This is also a job that I would consider simple for me now, but back then it's one of the hardest. Good. You need a hot air station for this. You can't do this with a soldering iron. Judging by like how the plastic kind of looks singed, I don't know if I would have done this from the top or the bottom. I think I would have done it from the bottom of the board, but that goes without saying now. Is something that I would advise. If you are heating up FPC connectors, you need to make sure that you're heating from the bottom of the board. Okay, so what I'm doing here is mixing the leaded solder with unleaded that's on the board. Would recommend, definitely. And I've got what looks to be a plethora of flux.
Should I tin the connector?
Absolutely not. Even if it's a new connector, it's the chance of burning the plastic on these connectors is so high. I would not tin them. I always recommend taking a donor one, because then that way you have the solder from the previous board. Okay, yeah, so this is a pull from a donor board. It should 100% be left. So I'm really interested to see like my position and stuff for this one.
I just lined it up roughly with the pins. I feel like it's going to be fine. Once the flux,
you have to line it up. You have to line it up pretty much as it needs to be, or as close to as what you can get it perfect.
And it went like off the board. The connector went off the board.
So that tells me that actually I was heating from the top. That tells me I was heating from the top.
No way.
You got very lucky.
No way.
So look, guys, this is the first time that I ever solder FPC connector, and people see me do this like on live streams and videos now, and it is made to look easy. But look, that excitement there is the reason why I got into this game. And then I went over, tested them, which is the right thing to do. I can see from this angle they all kind of look soldered, bar maybe a couple that I'd be a bit fishy about, and I'd go over and check those. But they tend to look soldered. What I would say is that you really need to clean the board in these scenarios, and I don't know if this is after a clean or not. That wasn't too bad. I would just say it sounds like and it looks like I've actually heated from the top of the board in that situation. Whereas now what I would do is I'd heat from underneath, and it becomes, the connectors are a lot more protected. Therefore, you don't melt the plastic and you do a better job, Well, I think that pretty much concludes it for this. I don't even necessarily want to call it an episode because I don't know how it's going to do. I have a feeling it's probably going to flop, but if I've helped at least one person out there with some soldering tips compared to what how I used to solder, then that's my job done. If you did enjoy it, hit the thumbs up button, subscribe to the channel if you're new around here, and as always, I shall see you in the next one. Peace.